Hello, everyone. So you can hear me, right? That's good. So it's our pleasure to have Ha-Joon Chang together with us today. We are very happy that it's our pleasure to have Ha-Joon Chang today with us. We are very happy that he accepted our invitation and he will give this talk. Probably you know him already, but I will introduce him a little bit. But before that, I want to mention that this Argumenta distinguished lecture is a part of our Argumenta project, which is funded by the Finnish Cultural Foundation. It's called Rethinking the Serviceability of Economics to Society. So with this project, we organize all kinds of events concerning economics as and its usefulness as a policy science. And this is one of those events, and this is our first Argumenta distinguished lecture. We will have 3 more of these. Now, today's speaker is Ha-Joon Chang. He's a professor at SOAS and a leading economist who advocates for pluralism and diversity in economics. He has written many books that challenge the conventional wisdom and offer alternative perspectives on economics and development. To be precise, I think he published 16 authored books, 4 of which co-authored and 10 edited books. Some of his widely discussed books include Kicking Away the Ladder, Bad Samaritans. He has also written some highly popular books for the general public. For example, 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism, Economics, the User Guide. These books explain economics in an accessible and engaging way, and his writings have been translated into 41 languages in 44 countries. Ha-Joon has received several international awards. 2003 Gunnar Myrdal Prize is one of them, and 2005 Leontief Prize is another prize he received, and he has been ranked among the world's most influential thinkers. I think it was in 2014. So it's our pleasure to have him here today. He will be talking about his latest book, Edible Economics. And the floor is yours, Ha-Joon.
Thank you, Emrah, for that generous introduction. And thank you, everyone, for coming on such a nice day. You know, having lived in England for over 36 years, I know the attraction of good weather. And I am very grateful that many of you have chosen me over the weather. So I'm truly grateful. I'm very grateful for the invitation for me to give the Argumenta lecture. And serviceability of economics is a topic dear to my heart. And I would like to thank the university for the invitation, and thank you everyone for coming. Now, this book brings together 2 of my greatest passions, economics and food. You know? And I left my native South Korea in 1986 and moved to Britain to study economics as a graduate student at the University of Cambridge. And at the time, my spoken English was very poor. I had never traveled abroad. You know, in those days, there was a total ban on foreign travel other than purposes approved by the government in South Korea. So I had never traveled abroad. In Britain, racial and cultural prejudices were rampant, and the weather was rubbish. But the most difficult thing was the food. You know, before moving to Britain, I had never thought food could taste so bad. Yeah? You know, everything was overcooked and bland, you know. And anything vaguely foreign was avoided with religious fervor. Huh? I mean, for me, the best the example that epitomized the British attitude towards foreign food at the time was this pizza restaurant chain called Pizza Land, which thank God does not exist anymore. This restaurant chain gave its customers an option to have their pizzas topped with a baked potato, because they were so worried that British customers would not be able to handle such a foreign thing as the tomato and mozzarella cheese, that they threw in a security blanket. You know? Here's your potato. You know? Hold on to it if you cannot deal with this foreign food. You know. And especially, I couldn't believe that Britain's national enemy #1, at least in terms of food, was garlic, which is the essence of life for Koreans. You know, the book starts with the foundation myth of the Korean nation, in which garlic plays the crucial role. You know? I mean, I'll leave you to find out exactly what role it played. Koreans consume, I mean, I was actually shocked to find out this statistics myself. Koreans consume, on average, 7.5 kilograms of garlic per year. You know, you thought that the French were the garlic eaters, they consume only 200 grams a year. Italians, 600 grams. Maybe the Chinese, the Spaniards, they maybe consume a bit more, but we are the garlic champion of the world. And then I arrived in a country where eating garlic was considered barbaric, if not being a crime against humanity. Yeah, so I was finding it very, very difficult to feed myself. I mean, luckily I was still in my 20s, and you know, in Korea we say that in your 20s you can even digest stones. So I would, just eat it. But you know, it was terrible. Of course, if you have been to Britain in recent period, you say that, well, that's not the Britain I know, because the Britain, especially London and other big cities like Birmingham and Manchester, the country has a very, very interesting culinary culture. You can get anything, you know. I mean, some months ago I was passing by a food court in London where they are selling dumplings from Uzbekistan. You know, I didn't know that they eat dumplings there. You know. I'm told that there's a restaurant that serves the fusion food between Japanese and Mexican in London. Another restaurant serving Korean, Peruvian fusion food. You know, Peruvian food itself is a fusion food because on the foundation is the Inca root, but then there's the Iberian influence. But then in the late 19th, early 20th century, they received a lot of immigrants as indentured laborers, basically fixed-term slaves from Japan and China. So they have very strong East Asian influence in their food, and mix that with Korean food. I really want to go and try what they're serving there. You know, my theory is that sometime in the late 1990s, the British people had this collective epiphany that their food sucks. No, but this was a great thing, because once you admit that your own food is bad, then you can become completely open-minded. You know, for example, you go to Italy. I mean, you have great Italian food. I love Italian food. Probably is that, other than Korean, my favorite cuisine, but there's little else. So if you stay in Italy for a week, 2 weeks, then you get a bit bored, because there is great Italian food, but other than a few very low-quality Chinese takeaways and the overpriced sushi bars, I mean, you have little else. So paradoxically, having good food made Italians less experimental, less exciting, yeah, in terms of food they eat. Yeah? Whereas in Britain, thanks to their own food being bad, once they started opening up their mind, it has now one of the most interesting and diverse culinary cultures in the world. Yeah? Now, my food universe, thanks to this, was expanding very, very fast in the last couple of decades. But my other universe, that is economics, was being sucked into a black hole. Yeah? You know, what is it? Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, so this is the cover of the American version. This is the British version. And then, yeah, as I explain in this book, my last book, Economics the User's Guide, which has a finished translation. And my new book will have a finished translation as well, but it hasn't come out yet. You know, economics until the 70s, until the early 1980s, there were many different schools of economics, at least 9 major schools, and easily 20 if you include some of the smaller schools, newer schools, like feminist and ecological schools, and split some of the bigger schools into sub-schools. You can have easily 20 different schools of economics. And until the early 80s, these different schools were coexisting and usually kind of competing with each other, but also learning from each other. You know, sometimes their competition was in a form of a death match. You know, the so-called calculation debate between the Marxists and the Austrians in the 1920s and 30s, the so-called capital theory debate between the Keynesians and the neoclassicals, the so-called Cambridge debate, because the Keynesians were based mainly in Cambridge, England. The neoclassicals were mainly based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, MIT and Harvard. And yeah, sometimes there were these death matches. Yeah? But at other times, you know, these schools were more kind of cordial to each other. They learned from each other, they stole from each other. Sometimes they created fusion theories, you know. Post-Keynesian economics is a fusion of Keynesian and Marxist economics. Yeah? So this made economics before the 80s diverse, interesting, and healthier, like the British food scene of today. However, since the 1980s, one school of economics, known as neoclassical school of economics, has come to dominate the subject almost completely. You know, I'm not saying that neoclassical economics is particularly bad. You know, like all other schools of economics, it was created to explain certain things, you know, certain particular context, with different views of human nature, different views of how technology evolves. It's not in this table, which is from that book, User's Guide. They also have different political and ethical assumptions. So each school is good at some things and not good at other things. Yeah? For example, neoclassical economics was created to explain market exchange. Yeah? It's good at that, yeah? But it has no production. Yeah? Okay, I mean, there's something called production function, but that's not a theory. Huh? It basically says that you can combine a certain amorphous quanta called capital and certain other amorphous quanta called labor, and somehow, according to some mechanical functional relationship, something comes out at the end called output. Yeah? I don't call that a theory. You know, it's not good at explaining innovation, unlike the Schumpeterian school, because it's basically equilibrium economics. Yeah? Other schools have other problems. Yeah? I'm not saying that it's only the neoclassical school that has problems, but the domination by one school has narrowed the subject of economics, making it boring and unhealthy, like the British food scene up to the mid-1990s. Let me give you a couple of examples, because what the domination of a particular theory does is actually more kind of far-reaching than the people think. Yeah? So, for example, the neoclassical economics regards self-seeking as the most important, if not the only, aspect of human nature. Yeah? And in this theory, therefore, those who behave in a non-selfish way are dismissed as suckers, as the Americans call them, or are suspected of having some ulterior motive. Yeah? Now, whether or not this is a correct description of what people are, if this view of the world dominates, which it does these days, it means that everyone has to behave in a selfish way, because if enough people believe that other people are all out to get them promote themselves, then you have to assume that you cannot trust anyone. Yeah? And that if everyone stops trusting each other, then even if you are deep down not like that, you have to behave in a selfish way, which makes the society kind of full of selfish people, and it becomes more difficult to cooperate with each other. For another example, neoclassical economics starts its analysis after taking the existing distribution of income, wealth, and power as given, so it is inherently bad at challenging the status quo. This is not to say that neoclassical economists do not want reforms. Actually, I think that the majority of neoclassical economists are reformists. Yeah? However, the idea of reform is constrained by their theoretical framework, because the ethical basis of neoclassical economics is what is known as the Paretian ideas. Yeah? So for those of you who haven't heard of this, in the 19th century, the predominant view among economists, including neoclassical economists, was that a principle known as utilitarianism. Yeah? This view that you should strive for the greatest happiness of the greatest majority. Yeah? But Pareto, this half Italian, half French economist who taught in Switzerland, came out in the late 19th, early 20th century saying, hang on, you cannot run a society on that basis. Yeah? Because what you are implicitly saying is that you can sacrifice a minority in the interest of the majority. Yeah? Okay, maybe you say we should sacrifice one person for the benefit of the whole society, but what if that one person becomes 10, 100, 10,000, 10 million? Yeah? So he said that you cannot call a social change an improvement unless it leaves no one worse off. Yeah? Now, this is a very important ethical principle that tries to protect minorities against majority interest. But like all ethical principles, if you take it to the extreme, it becomes a monster. Yeah? Because this means that however unequal the society is, you cannot make any change unless those who benefit from the current social arrangement refuse to give away anything. Yeah? So adherence to this Paretian ethical principle inherently restricts the kind of reform that neoclassical economists are willing to entertain. Yeah? Let me give you a more concrete example. Paul Krugman, as reformist as you get for a neoclassical economist. And I'm told that in an interview he partly recanted his position, but in the late 1990s he got into a bit of a fight with some American NGOs which are trying to boycott these clothing companies that were exploiting cheap labor in Bangladesh. Yeah? And Krugman waded into this debate and said, look at that, you know, kind-hearted NGO people, you are well-intentioned, but you are mistaken, yeah? Because what you are suggesting is based on the view that these Bangladeshi workers have a choice between low-wage jobs and high-wage jobs. Yeah? So you are saying that if we boycott the clothing companies in America that buy from these exploitative Bangladesh factories, these workers can get another job. Yeah? No, the choice they have is between a low-wage job and no job. Yeah? So if you actually campaign to boycott these companies, you are hurting the Bangladesh workers. Yeah? Absolutely correct in the short run, but what if Bangladesh can ban child labor? It will raise adult wages. Yeah? What if we can have land reform? It will keep more people in the land, the countryside, so there will be less downward pressure on urban wages. What if we can use industrial policy to promote more high productivity industries that will create more high wage jobs? Maybe the Bangladeshi workers will have a different choice. Yeah? But Krugman never talked about those other options. Yeah? Because his thinking was basically neoclassical. Given the current arrangements, what can you do to improve people's lots? Yeah? And not hurt anyone. Yeah? Now, when I say this, you may say, oh, that's a pipe dream. Yeah? I mean, Bangladesh is never going to have that. But that's actually what happened in my native South Korea in the 1960s and 70s. Yeah? We had a land reform. We banned child labor, well, at least until the age of 12, by making primary education compulsory. And I emphasize the word compulsory because it meant that if you don't send your kid to school, you went to prison. Yeah? And we had all these industrial policies to create the high productivity industries, which later created a lot of high-paid jobs. Yeah? Yeah, so these kind of changes are possible, but even Krugman was not willing to entertain these things because his thinking about reform was basically confined by the neoclassical framework. Yeah? Anyway, so, you know, I've just given you a couple of examples where, you know, the neoclassical way of thinking is particularly problematic, but I'm not saying that it's a particularly bad school. You know, all other schools, I can do this kind of exercise to all other schools, yeah? Because they all have blind spots, they all have prejudices, they all have the areas where theories are weak, yeah? The point is that the world is too complex. No single theory can explain everything. And therefore, we need pluralism in economics. You need all these different theories to be able to deal with the world. I mean, I don't have time to go into any theoretical arguments. So let me just do it by giving you one example, yeah? What I call the Singapore problem, yeah? Or life is stranger than fiction. Yeah? You know, Singapore, when you hear about Singapore in the standard economics books, when you read about it in the financial press, you will hear about this free trade policy and its welcoming attitude towards foreign investment, which it has. Yeah? But you will never be told that 90% of land in Singapore is owned by the government, 85% of housing is supplied by the government-owned housing corporation, and a staggering 22% of GDP is produced by state-owned enterprises known as government-linked corporations in that country. Yeah? So I challenge my graduate students, you know, give me one economic theory that can single-handedly explain Singapore. Doesn't matter what it is, neoclassical, Marxist, Keynesian. There's no such theory because Singapore is the product of a series of very pragmatic choices, taking the structural constraints as given, but also trying to figure out a way to do things better in those under those constraints. So, I mean, I can sorry, I shouldn't talk too much about this. I can go into the details if you want later, but the world is full of these examples. Another example that might be familiar to you, Sweden. I mean, it's that together with Finland, one of the most kind of equal countries in the world, but it has the worst corporate concentration in the world. The Wallenbergs. There's no single enterprise group that controls so much of the economy in the world. The Wallenbergs at this height controlled companies whose collective capitalization was nearly half of Stockholm Stock Exchange. It's still over 30%. I mean, you might have heard about these Korean conglomerates like Samsung and Hyundai and so on. I mean, they pale in comparison with Sweden. So which theory explains how you can have the economy that has one of the most equal income distributions in the world with literally the worst corporate concentration? Anyway, the world is full of these examples. So we need a plurality of theories to understand it. Now, some of you might be sitting there thinking, okay, fair enough, but what does it have to do with me? I'm not an economist. I don't work in the financial sector or corporate sector. Why should I worry? But I think you should all learn some economics because, like it or not, economics has become the language of power, and you cannot change the world without understanding it. I would put it even more strongly and say that in a capitalist economy, democracy is meaningless unless all citizens understand at least some economics. Especially under the more market-oriented, neoliberal, or whatever you may call it, the more the kind of market-focused the phase of capitalism that we have been living in the last few decades. Everything has to justify its existence in terms of the economic value it brings to the society. Whether it's teaching of ancient languages, foundation of funding of museums. In Britain, I have even met some people who try to justify the monarchy in terms of the tourist revenue that it brings in. No, this is ridiculous. I'm an anti-monarchist, so I can probably say, I'll accept the monarchy because at least it makes money. Well, it doesn't, but because British taxpayers give a huge amount of subsidies. But even if it did, those who believe in the monarchy cannot say that because in Britain, at least in the formal sense, monarchy is the foundation institution. The British monarch is the head of the Church of England, which is the official state religion. And you are trying to justify its existence in terms of the tourist revenue that you are trying to bring in. It's come to that. So in that kind of society, if you don't know your economics, what are you voting for? I mean, this is why a lot of Americans voted for George W. Bush, saying that he looks like a kind of guy that I could have a beer with. Well, on that qualification, I can become the President of the United States because I don't mind having beer with anyone. I mean, what a way to choose the occupant of the most powerful political office in the world. So I believe that the knowledge of economics is crucial for effective functioning of democracy. And for that reason, I have taken it upon myself to be an advocate of what I call mass economic literacy, teaching economics to people. And this is why I have been writing this kind of popular economics books in the last 15 years, despite the fact that this does not get any point in my academic career. Well, probably gets negative points, yeah, for daring to teach economics to ordinary people. Yeah. Now, having written quite a few of these books, I have realized that, yeah, once people pick up the book, my books are useful in making them understand economics, but many people are not even going to pick up the book because they see the word economics and they think, oh, this is too dry, this is boring, this is only for quote-unquote experts. Yeah? So in this book, I'm trying to draw in readers who normally wouldn't even touch an economics book by basically offering these food stories that are at least interesting to non-economists. Yeah? So my food stories are a bit like the ice cream that some of your mothers might have offered you in return for you eating some vegetables. Yeah? So it's essentially bribes. Yeah? But my bribes are better, yeah? Because in the book, ice cream comes first. Yeah? The food stories come first. So you read them, and if you don't like the rest of the chapters, you don't have to read the rest. Yeah? Although my hope is that the food stories are interesting enough that people keep reading, and then by mistake they end up reading economics. Yeah? And indeed, on Amazon websites, I see a few reviews that are saying that. Yeah? I picked up this book thinking that it's a book about economics of food, how food is grown, traded, consumed, and wasted, and so on. And then I realized it's not, but thanks to this trick, I ended up reading about economics, which I appreciate. So, that's the hope that people read about economics by mistake. Yeah? Okay, so each of the chapter is named after a food ingredient. Garlic, chocolate, chili, lime, shrimp, acorn. Well, you probably didn't know that you can eat acorn, but we do in Korea in large quantities. Yeah? Well, after all, you are the people who eat pine tree bark. Yeah? I love your the crisp bread with the pine tree bark, which I understand you ate because you had nothing else to eat. Yeah? So the acorns are a bit like that for Koreans. Yeah? Anyway, so each of the chapters starts with a story about some food. It could be about this biology, about this the significance in some particular culture or historical events. It could be about this origin and spreading. It could be about my personal relationship with that food item. In the chocolate chapter, I confess that I'm addicted to chocolate. Yeah? But before you know it, the food stories are somehow transformed into economic stories through what I call the Simpsons approach to writing. Yeah? When you watch these Simpsons episodes, actually, I must confess, I haven't watched it for the last decade or so because they are not as good as before anymore. But when you watch Simpsons episodes, they always start with a short clip, maybe 1 minute, maybe half a minute even, usually involving Bart Simpson, some totally wacky story, which sometimes turn out to be crucial to the rest of the story, but most of the time it has nothing to do with the main story. And my books are a bit like that. Yeah? So, well, in some chapters, the initial food stories are important for the main stories, but usually it is not. And I start with this food story, and through what I call traveling down the rabbit hole, as the famous expression comes from Alice in Wonderland. I start with the food story, but somehow it ends up with something else. So I have a chapter called Carrot, which starts with a story about carrot. How, many other things, but one of them is how the orange carrot that is the standard carrot these days is actually the latest invention. Carrots started out as white, and then yellow and purple varieties developed, and the orange carrot was invented in the Netherlands only in the 17th century. And then somehow I end up with a discussion on the problems with the current systems of intellectual property rights. The chicken chapter starts with a story about an in-flight meal on the Aeroflot during its Soviet days, and ends with a discussion on the inequality. There's a chapter called Beef, which actually doesn't even start with beef right at the beginning. It starts with the Uruguayan football player called Luis Suarez, who, unfortunately is famous for biting other players, despite his considerable football skills. But somehow ends with a discussion on the problem with the international trading system of today. So it's that kind of a book. Okay, now let me talk about a few chapters just to give you a flavor of how I do this. So the first chapter I want to talk about is noodle. According to the International Association of Instant Noodles, I haven't made it up. Apparently that society exists. Koreans are the biggest eaters of instant noodles. Apparently, South Koreans. South Koreans go through 80 servings of instant noodles per person per year. Given that there are 50 million of us, this works out to be like 4 billion packets of instant noodles per year. It's a huge amount. We make noodles out of all carbohydrate. So not only wheat, but we use buckwheat, we use potato, we use sweet potato, we use acorn, we use rice, barley, green beans, anything. Anything carbohydrate is turned into noodle. But the interesting thing is that despite the variety of the ingredient, there are only two shapes to our noodles. String or strip. In the other noodle-obsessed nation, namely Italy, it's the opposite. They use essentially one ingredient to make noodles, wheat. Some poor people, I'm told that used to mix chestnut powder into wheat because wheat was expensive to make the pasta, but basically it's one ingredient. But sorry, I haven't. So these are the Korean instant noodles, and then, but the Italians make up for the uniformity of ingredient by varying the shapes. Apparently, there are like over 200 pasta shapes. Not just strings and strips, but tubes, sheets, screws, butterflies, human ear. I read that there's a pasta shaped like a radiator. Why? I don't know, but So these two nations are obsessed with noodle, but in completely different ways. The Italian obsession with the noodle shape is such that this company, Barilla, which is the biggest pasta company in the world, through its on-market sub-brand, Voyello, once even commissioned this guy to come up with the best shape of pasta. This person, I don't think anyone knows him, is called Giugiaro Giugiaro. Giugiaro is indisputably the most successful car designer in human history. He has designed over 100 cars for virtually all car manufacturers in the world, except for Mercedes-Benz and Nissan and Chrysler. I mean, design cars for everyone. Barilla commissioned Giugiaro to come up with the best shape of pasta, and he literally engineered a new shape of pasta which combines a tube with a wave. Yeah? This is called Marille. It's beautiful. Yeah? Unfortunately, it wasn't that successful because Giugiaro's idea was that this holds the maximum amount of sauce. Yeah? So this has to be, and looks beautiful, so this has to be the answer. But unfortunately, this pasta was difficult to cook al dente. Yeah? No, the al dente is so important to the Italians. Yeah? For those of you who haven't heard of the expression, it basically means that to the teeth, meaning slightly sticking to the teeth, so not overcooked, not undercooked. Yeah? But given the complexity of the shape, it meant that if you cook one part al dente, the complicated part, then the other part becomes too soft. Yeah? And if you cook the other part al dente, the complicated part becomes too hard. Yeah? So it was not a commercial success, but I mean, Giugiaro doesn't care. I mean, I read some of his interviews where he said, yeah, actually I owe my fame to this pasta because, you know, even though I have designed over 100 cars, who knows who designed what car. Yeah? But thanks to this, to the failure of this pasta, everyone knows my name, but as far as they're interested in the pasta. Yeah? Now, one of the cars that Giugiaro designed, even before Marille pasta, was for this unknown Korean company called Hyundai. And this was designed in the early 70s when he was already famous, but not the king of the world. This is the first car that Hyundai, the Korean company, produced of its own model called Pony. Yeah? Now, when Pony went into production in 1976, Hyundai produced 10,000 of these cars. Huh? In that same year, Ford produced 1.9 million cars, and General Motors produced 4.8 million cars. If I took a time machine and went back to 1976 and told people, look, this is totally unknown car manufacturer, more of a glorified mechanics shop called Hyundai in this low middle income country called South Korea, whose income at the time was 30% less than that of Ecuador's. Yeah? But give it just over 30 years, it will be bigger than Ford. In less than 40 years, it will be bigger than General Motors. What would the people have said? They would have put me in a mental hospital. Yeah? But this is what happened. Yeah? From 2009, Hyundai produced more cars than Ford. From 2015, it has been producing more cars than General Motors. Yeah? Now, when people hear about this kind of huge corporate success, they immediately say, oh, entrepreneurs. Yeah? Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos. Yeah, Hyundai also had the entrepreneurs, not just one, but two. Mr. Chung Ju-young, who was the founder of the group, and Mr. Chung Se-young, who was the younger brother of the other the guy who actually ran the car division in the beginning. And he was so crucial in the launch of the pony model that he was later nicknamed Pony Chang. I mean, these guys put money into this loss-making car business. Yeah? Hyundai started out as a construction company and made some money in the late 1960s, early 70s, because they started building roads in Vietnam during the wartime when other companies were not really interested in going there because it was so dangerous. They went there, made a packet of money, and then they decided they want to do better things. Yeah? So car was one of the first things they started. But initially, you know, you can imagine, I mean, who's going to buy those cars? Yeah? So they lost money for like 10 years, but they poured money into it with this vision that one day we are going to compete with the biggest boys. And they succeeded. Yeah? So they were those entrepreneurs, but actually if you look at this story more deeply, you realize that it wasn't just those guys. Yeah? It was the workers, the engineers, and the scientists who had to absorb these new technologies. You know, Korea didn't used to make any cars. I mean, they assembled a few thousand cars of made of imported parts, but they had to now learn from scratch how to make cars. Yeah? So, you know, all these workers, engineers, scientists, the professional managers, they work long hours to absorb these new technologies, adapt them to local conditions, and eventually come up with their own innovations. Yeah? I mean, Hyundai started building its own engine, car engine, in 1991, and you know, that was a big feat because even now, I mean, there are only like 5-6 countries which has their own the automobile engines. Yeah? It's a very difficult thing to actually do. Yeah? And then there was the government, you know, at the time, you know, actually the reason why Hyundai built the pony model was back in 1973 when Hyundai was still assembling imported parts for Ford model, which with which it had a joint venture. The Korean government in 1973 announced that any car manufacturer that cannot come up with its own model in the next few years will have its license canceled. Yeah? Yeah, so some companies actually had their license canceled. Yeah? There were a couple of others who stuck around, tried to do something like Hyundai. They didn't do as well as Hyundai, but you know, the very start of a serious automobile business was with a prompt by the government, which was then backed with money, serious money. I mean, at the time, all the banks in Korea were owned by the government. And the government designated 6-7 industries as strategic industries, steel, automobile, machine tools, petrochemical, and so on. And then they were giving a lot of subsidized loans to these companies. At the time, the government also had the strong focus on the export, so they gave hugely subsidized loans to any company that were exporting. And yeah, Hyundai took advantage of it and broke into the American market within 10 years of the start of the Pony. And then there were the consumers. The Korean government banned the import of any foreign car until 1988, banned the import of Japanese cars until 1998. So during that period, Korean consumers basically had to ride around in the bad cars. But without that initial, the protected market, Hyundai could not have survived. Hyundai could not have upgraded its technologies. I mean, can you imagine that in, say, 1980, Korean government liberalizing the car industry? It would have been wiped out. Yeah, so the conclusion from this chapter is that maybe at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when you had, I don't know, factories with 5 machines, 10 machines, 100 workers, 150 workers, it was possible for a genius entrepreneur to come up with an innovation that changes the face of the industry. But at least from the early 20th century, perhaps from the late 19th century, entrepreneurship has been a collective activity. Well, I mean, this country is another great example of how this was done. Yeah? Because Nokia started out as a logging company and then diversified into making galoshes and coating electric cable, and then moved into making mechanical telephone exchanges. Nokia, the electronics division, was set up in 1960, never made money until 1977, so a lot of cross-subsidization from companies within the same enterprise group, government protection, favors for procurement. This is how enterprises have been grown. And it has not been an exception. Countries like Korea and Finland have not been an exception. If you go far back in history, this is practically what all enterprises that were like, at least from the late 19th century. And even today, we say, oh, America has the free enterprise system, free enterprise. The Silicon Valley, people think, oh, the Silicon Valley exists because there are a lot of clever people and there's a good venture capital system, but it would not have existed unless the US government poured in huge amount of money doing research on technologies whose use at the time were completely uncertain and at best confined to military operations. The US government funded up to 2/3 of entire national R&D during the Cold War, developing technologies, computers, internet, semiconductors, GPS, touchscreen, almost everything, almost every technology that the Silicon Valley is founded upon were initially created for free by the US government. No, it was a hugely the collective effort. Yeah? Anyway, so the reason why I emphasize the collective nature of entrepreneurship is because developing countries are these days getting all this advice from the likes of the World Bank, which has, no empirical foundation on how to promote the private sector. Yeah? So the World Bank has this the index called the Ease of Doing Business Index. Yeah? And the kind of things they recommend there are what? Yeah? Low corporation tax, yeah? Make it easier to register an enterprise, yeah? Make it easier to pay taxes. Yeah? Well, I suppose some of these things might be helpful, but this is not how you grow business. Yeah? Businesses are grown like that, like Hyundai, like Nokia. Yeah? For those who advocate the low corporation income tax, I ask them to think about what I call the Paraguay paradox. Yeah? What it is that if low corporation income tax is a good thing in itself, every company in the world should move to Paraguay because corporation income tax is only 10%. Yeah? But a lot of companies would rather pay 29% in Germany and do business there because you might be paying low price in Paraguay, but the service you get in return is low quality. Yeah? It's not worth the money. Yeah? We have poor infrastructure, badly educated labor, malfunctioning legal system. So a lot of companies would rather pay 29% and do business in Germany. Yeah? Anyway, so this view that entrepreneurship is what the heroic individuals do, which might have made some sense in the 19th century, is not valid anymore, but the recommendations that you get from the likes of the World Bank and the mainstream economists who support it are like this, yeah? I mean, totally useless. Yeah? Okay, how am I doing with time? Do I have, how much do I have? Huh? Okay, yeah, no, it's just that I want some time for question and answers. So. 50 minutes more? Yeah, okay. Okay, then let me give you just another chapter, which is chilli. You know, if you look at the world map and plot how much chili different countries use in their cooking, there's something that I call the chili belt. Yeah? I mean, starting in Mexico, of course, where chili comes from, and then Peru, and then North Africa, West Africa, and then South Asia, Southeast Asia, Southern China, well, more correctly, Southwestern China, and then reaching up to Korea, which is actually quite far up north, but somehow we love spicy food. Yeah? Now, people who are from outside the chili belt find it difficult to deal with chili because it's actually quite toxic chemical. Yeah? No, actually, it doesn't give you pain as such, but it kind of has this very strange neurochemical quality that makes you think you are having a pain. Yeah? So, I mean, the chemistry is a bit complicated and I don't fully understand, but basically when you have chili, you have kind of the sweat, you can have stomach cramp and all kinds of things. So people who are not used to chili find it difficult to deal with this. So restaurants are serving food from the chili belt in non-chili belt countries have, without anyone coordinating it, come up with this notification system. Yeah? So I bet that they do it here. I mean, if you go to a Thai restaurant or Korean restaurant, they would have these chili signs next to the name of the dish. Yeah? So no chili, 1 chili, 2 chilies, maybe sometimes 3 chilies. Yeah? Some years ago, I took a friend of mine, this British guy called Duncan Green, who is one of the top advisors to the NGO Oxfam, to a Sichuan restaurant. Sichuan is in the southwest, where Mr. Deng Xiaoping comes from. And the cuisine from there uses notoriously huge quantities of chili. So their food looks like this. Huh? Well, these chilies are not necessarily the hottest. Yeah? So despite the amount, maybe it's not necessarily hotter than, say, Thai or Mexican food, but that's a pretty impressive amount. More importantly, they use chili for everything. I mean, anyway, so this restaurant had a notification system that went up to 5 chilies. Yeah? So given the amount of chili they use, they probably needed a finer distinction between different dishes. And when my friend Duncan saw it, his face went white. He said, gosh, that 5 chilies. Yeah? I don't think I can handle that. And I said, yeah, but we are in Sichuan restaurant. There's no point in avoiding chili. Yeah? You should. So we had a negotiation. So that as a good Korean, I wanted to try 5 chili dishes, but I made my concessions. So I said, okay, we will order 1 3 chili thing, one 4 chili thing, one 2 chili thing, and he begged, can I at least have one dish which has no chili, because I'm worried about it. Yeah? So I said, okay. Now, when the food arrived, Duncan went white again, because his no chili dish had 6 chilies, the size of a pinky. Yeah? So he called the waitress, excuse me, that there must have been a mistake. And then the waitress came and said, I ordered the dish with no chili, and I have 6 chilies here. And the waitress said, no, there's no mistake. The chili sign is an expression of relative hotness. No chili doesn't necessarily mean that there's being no chili, because there's no dish in Sichuan food without chili. Yeah? So Duncan was at shock. He took out the chilies. The food already had some chilies because of these things lying over it. I mean, he was okay with that, but other dishes he found difficult, you know. There's happy ending though, because he tried it and he sweated and suffered, but he liked it. After a few years, he kept going back, and this became one of his favorite restaurants. So there was a happy ending, but you know, the episode shows how when something is ubiquitous, you stop seeing it. Yeah? So the people who are running this Sichuan restaurant, having come from a culinary culture where almost everything has chili, didn't think that you know, having chilies in the so-called no chili dishes was a problem. Yeah? Actually, there's something like this in economics, because in counting our output, the most frequently used measure is GDP, gross domestic product. We do not count something that is so ubiquitous that we fail to see it, which is the household work and care work that we do at home and in communities, mostly done by women. Yeah? So GDP doesn't include unpaid care work, which means that there's a great proposal to increase GDP. You know, pair mothers with their children and let them swap the children and let them pay each other. You know, economically they'll be the same, but now that you have created extra GDP. Even better, if they charge each other 10 times the going rate, their contribution to GDP will be increased by 10 times. Yeah? I mean, how absurd. Yeah? It's not just unpaid care work that is not counted, but it's also paid care work. Well, I mean, it's counted because there's a market transaction involved, but we know how undervalued it is. Yeah? You know, this became very apparent during the pandemic. Yeah? During the pandemic, we realized that there are people without whom the world will still keep going, like university professors. Yeah? But there are people without whom the society will collapse. Yeah? You know, medical doctors, school teachers, yeah? And people working in the old people's homes and so on. Yeah? And then we realized that there are people who are, strictly speaking, not doing care work, but who are engaged in what some economists call reproductive labor, meaning people who enable the society to renew itself. Yeah? So people growing food, people transporting and buying, selling food and other essential items. Yeah? People who are doing delivery work, people who are maintaining the infrastructure, people who are running public transport. Yeah? So a lot of countries come to realize that these people are essential for the survival of society. So the UK designated these people key workers. The Americans designated them essential employees, and they were praised for being heroes. They were given some privilege. So at the height of the pandemic in the UK, there was a shortage of some essential food items like eggs and wheat, wheat flour and so on. Yeah? But if you are a nurse working in NHS, or if you're a school teacher, you could go to these supermarkets and show them your ID, and they'll behind the counter get these things out for you, yeah? Because they were reserved for these people. Yeah? These the key workers could send their children to school even when the school was generally closed, because they recognize that if these people have to stay at home to take care of kids, the health system will collapse. Yeah? There'll be no food available in the supermarkets. Yeah? But then we realized that except for a handful of top medical doctors, these are all very poorly paid people. Yeah? Okay, part of it is because of gender discrimination. Yeah? Because especially in the paid care work, there's a high concentration of female workers, and women get discriminated in the labor market and get paid less than their male counterparts. Huh? I mean, it's very serious in some countries, like my own, South Korea. We have the highest gender wage gap in the OECD, 30%. Yeah. In some other countries, it's less serious, like in Finland, but there is the gender wage disparity. Yeah? But more importantly, this was because we left it to the market to decide what is more valuable. The market is a $1, one vote system, not a one person, one vote system. So if there's money behind the demand, something will be provided. If there isn't, it won't be provided, however important it may be. So once again, we saw this during the pandemic very, very clearly. While the doctors and nurses were falling ill and some of them dying because of the lack of the protective equipment in countries like the US and the UK, I don't know about this country, while old people were dying in the care homes because they didn't have enough the care home workers to give the residents enough protection. These tech billionaires like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, they were having a private space race. Yeah? I can shoot this rocket that go further than you, haha. Yeah? In what world is that okay? Yeah? Well, in this world, but in our ethical world, I mean, this is totally unacceptable. But that's what market gives you. Yeah? I mean, if there's money behind it, however frivolous, useless, ridiculous it is, it will be provided. Yeah? If there's no money behind it, however serious it is, it won't be provided. Yeah? So that makes you rethink how we balance things in society. I'm not in favor of abolishing the market, but you need to balance it with this deeper social considerations. Yeah? And very quickly, I have another important theme that runs through the book, which are especially highlighted in these chapters on beef and okra, but also in other places. So I'll quickly present the idea. Freedom is so important in economic discourses, especially in the more market-oriented varieties of the economics, free market, free trade, they are considered sacrosanct. You know? But even in the less market-oriented approach, like Amartya Sen's work, you know, he presents development as freedom. Yeah? So we are so used to thinking freedom is a good thing. Freedom is guaranteed by free market and free trade. But of course, when you look at the reality, you realize that very often free trade and free market meant unfreedom for many people. So for example, during the 19th century, before the Civil War, the southern slave-owning states in the United States advocated free trade, because it was in their interest. I mean, why should they subsidize the inefficient Yankee manufacturers when they can sell their cotton and tobacco and import better manufactured products from the European countries, especially Britain? So they are dead against protectionism and advocated free trade, while they were depriving the enslaved Africans of every kind of freedom, economic, political, personal, and so on. For another example, when General Pinochet staged a coup d'etat in 1973 in Chile, when he basically killed a few thousand people to uphold the free market economy against the quote-unquote socialist encroachment by Salvador Allende, who probably wouldn't be counted as a socialist in Finland. I mean, he'll be probably center-right in Finnish terms, but in Latin American terms, he was considered a great socialist. When he did that, the gurus of free market like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek openly supported Pinochet, because in their ethical system, economic freedom, especially freedom of the property owners to use their property for the most profitable purposes, was the most important freedom. If that clashed with political freedom, so be it. Killing a few thousand people is okay. In their books, even within economic freedom, freedom of the property owners is more important than the freedom of workers to unionize. Freedom of local communities to be protected from environmental degradation. So, they have this particular view of economic freedom, which, however, is obscured as something that is a universal freedom. So the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Foundation, they keep publishing this index about the index of economic freedom, which basically means economic freedom over political, social, and other freedoms. Even within economic freedoms, is that freedom for property owners over other people's freedom. Just for another example, the official history of capitalism says that the first free trading nation was Britain, which ditched its agricultural protection with the abolition of the so-called Corn Laws in 1846 and transitioned to free trade, and that's why it became the world's economic hegemon. A lot of untruths in that story, but even more interesting is that actually Britain wasn't the first country to practice the free trade. The first countries, in plurals, that practiced free trade were the Latin American countries. Because when they became independent between 1810s and 1830s from their Spanish and Portuguese colonial masters, they were forced to sign what later came to be known as unequal treaties, in which they were deprived of a lot of rights. So one of them was called extraterritoriality, which basically said, your legal system is not up to scratch. So if one of our citizens, say a British guy or French guy, commits the crime in your country, he has to be sent back to Britain or France because we don't trust in your legal system. Another thing they were deprived of was the tariff autonomy, meaning the right to set their own tariffs. Yeah? So these countries are forced to have some tariff, very low, that 1, 3, 5%, uniform, so that it doesn't affect trade flows and they can collect some revenue. And yeah, therefore they practice free trade. Yeah? But not out of free political choice. Yeah? This was done under what later came to be known as gunboat diplomacy. Basically, you threaten them with military force, and all the weaker countries that didn't become official colonies, like China and Thailand and Iran and even the Ottoman Empire, throughout the 19th century are forced to sign these unequal treaties and practice free trade, while most European countries practice protectionism during the 19th century. Yeah? But I mean, never mind what happened in Europe. I mean, is it free trade if you do it because you are forced to do it? Maybe it is, because free trade basically only means freedom for those who are doing the trade. Yeah? It doesn't say anything about why the countries are doing it, who set the rules and so on. Yeah? So we need to be extremely careful with this language of freedom, which has become so entrenched in our economic thinking that when someone bandies about the word freedom, but free, immediately the other guy looks like a bad guy. Yeah? So whenever there's some international conflict in terms of international trade, people worry about the collapse of the free trade system and the rise of fascism, and this is all nonsensical. Yeah? I mean, the world trading system didn't collapse in the 1930s because of protectionism. It basically collapsed because of the Great Depression, which depressed demand and made trade credit unavailable. I mean, this is according to the work of the eminent American economic historian Peter Temin of MIT. Yeah? Anyway, I mean, I could go on with these examples, but the point is, unless we understand the complicated and often contradictory relationship between capitalism and freedom, we cannot make capitalism a more productive and humane system, because once you totally buy into this language of freedom, basically what the freedom you will get is freedom of property owners. Anyway, let me stop there. Thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to take your comments and questions. Thank you. So maybe you can...
First of all, thank you very much for this wonderful talk. And so if you have questions, we can take them.
I'll use this mic.
Thank you very much. Stand or... Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your wonderful lecture. My name is Riina Bhatia, and I used to be a student at SOAS, so I'm very much familiar with your work, and I'm also a co-founder of Rethinking Economics Finland, so economic pluralism is very much something I held very dear. And I very much agree with a lot of things that you said, and they were very familiar. However, I think there's one thing, one important thing that you didn't mention, and maybe you do mention that in your book, which is economics and ecological destruction that we are seeing at the moment in the world. And I think many of the examples that you mentioned, and the examples of developmental states and the kind of development that has been enabled by that, are very wonderful. However, they took place at a very different time when, the ecological boundaries of the planet weren't necessarily the most worrying thing that we were facing. And a few weeks ago, I went to Brussels, where we had this post-growth conference. I'm not sure if you've heard of that. But I would just like to be very curious what you think about this degrowth, post-growth debate at the moment, and how does that fit into the current models? And what is your take on the ecological crisis that you're facing at the moment?
Sure, thank you. Shall I answer them one by one? Yes. Well, I do actually talk about the climate change and other ecological issues in one of the chapters called Lyme, which strangely starts with this horrible disease called scurvy, and somehow ends up with the discussion of climate change. Yes, of course, these days we need to kind of think about the planetary boundary whenever we talk about growth, industrialization, and so on. But first of all, I think we need to separate the rich countries and the developing countries in talking about this. So first of all, growth is imperative for poor countries. I mean, what is poor? Also, how different groups and individuals in the poor country have different carbon footprint. We need to discuss that. But essentially, for poor countries, the estimates vary, but countries with less than $6,000–7,000 per capita income, the course of climate change is not going to be changed, whatever they do. And in those countries, growth is literally a matter of life and death. And I've seen it with my own eyes. When you have $2,000, $3,000 per capita income, growth makes that people live longer. It means that you don't have to see your child die when they are like 1 or 2. You can eat another bowl of rice. You can heat your house a bit more and don't freeze in the winter. It's not a matter of, having another phone, another handbag. No. So for these countries, growth is imperative. They need to achieve it in whatever means possible. And what they do isn't going to really affect the big picture. So you need to, this UN principle of shared but differentiated responsibilities, I think needs to be remembered, because otherwise the ecological concerns become an excuse for another form of what I call kicking at the ladder. I mean, we happen to kind of exhaust all the planetary capacity, so now you have to basically live in abject poverty and let your people die. I mean, that's totally unacceptable to me. But beyond that level, yes, I mean, countries need to take serious actions in which the developing countries need to be, helped, not just help. I mean, there has to be, the climate reparation. I mean, the rich countries, well, including South Korea itself now, I mean, they have blown this. And the developing countries are suffering the consequences disproportionately. So there has to be reparation. There has to be loss and damage, which is separate from reparation in my thinking. There has to be technology transfer, changes in the international trading rules, intellectual property rights system. I mean, without these, the developing countries will find it difficult to come up with the renewable energy technologies and other technologies that need to have a more ecologically sustainable forms of growth. Now, for the richer countries, degrowth, I mean, I totally agree that these countries do not need more material expansion. But I think the term degrowth, I haven't written about this in this book, but the term degrowth, I think still buys into this growth agenda. I mean, what we need to talk about is how to redefine human well-being. I mean, we need to expand collective consumption. We need to, I mean, Finland probably doesn't have that problem, but in countries like Korea, even if it still quite rich, people work too much. Yeah? So they don't have time to be happy by spending time with friends and traveling and so on. So what do? They do internet shopping, yeah? The clothes, handbags, yeah? I mean, the silly gadgets, you know. I mean, we need to rethink the way we define human well-being rather than talking about degrowth, yeah? But, I mean, I generally agree with what these people say when it comes to rich countries. Yeah? We don't need more material production. Also, it's not just a matter of reducing carbon footprints. We also need to reduce material footprints. Yeah? But in the story, I would also emphasize that people who are concerned with ecological sustainability probably underestimate the importance of technological progress. Yeah? Although I'm not one of those people who say technology will solve the problem. No, it won't. Yeah? We need to completely change the way we live and consume and work and so on. Yeah? But let's not underestimate the importance of technologies, because we haven't got enough time left to do this simply by changing the way we live. Yeah? We need all the technologies that we can muster. Yeah? Anyway, let's leave it there. It's a very complex subject, but.
Hello. Thank you very much first for the lecture. It was great. I'm an economics student in undergraduate, and you mentioned a lot throughout the whole book and throughout now this lecture, the role that this connection between ethics and economics. And for example, in undergraduate programs, we don't really have this teaching of ethics program. So what do you think is the role of, what role should ethics have in this teaching of economics, especially undergraduate programs?
No, I think the ethics is so important. And, frankly, I'm not coming to this from kind of philosophy, methodology, ethics point of view. I call myself a pedestrian economist. I mean, I have not really seriously thought of and written about those lofty kind of issues. But as I try to grapple with more pragmatic issues, I keep hitting that wall. Yeah? I mean, what these people say are based on these kind of ethical assumptions, and unless you buy into them, you cannot really endorse these policies. But in economics degrees, you never teach ethics. I mean, probably people haven't even these days heard of the Pareto, yeah? Because it's so kind of accepted that there was a time in the 1940s and 50s when even within the neoclassical camp, there were Paretians and non-Paretians. Yeah? Ethics was a serious issue. But now, I mean, this is completely forgotten. And, I mean, you are taught this system of thinking without being told what ethical foundation it is built upon. Yeah? Maybe it's because the economists want to present economics as a science, yeah? And therefore bringing in ethics that exposes their limits. But whatever the reason is, it's not there. And I think it's really seriously creating a generation of economists who haven't even thought of these important issues. Yeah? So yes, I mean, the ethics plays. Yeah? Yeah.
Well, thank you, first of all, for a great talk. And I have the second on British food is rubbish, first of all. I have basically two questions. By the way, my name is Lars Bruno from the Norwegian Business School. Kind of first, you mentioned kind of that the whole kind of space, sending people, or the space race, at the same time we had Corona is kind of unreal in some sense. But I'm curious about what you think about, say, for instance, you have the Premier League football players earning tons of money.
Sorry?
You have the Premier League football players, which earn tons of money, and you have kind of the healthcare workers, which do a probably a much more, how to say it, useful job in society. What would be kind of your ideas how to correct that type of kind of, how should I put it? I will almost call it market failure because I'm trained as an economist, but that's what I want to call it. And the second question I had essentially was, you mentioned the homogeneity of neoclassical economics, and you didn't really, during your talk about how we could kind of increase pluralism within the econ departments. Because I work in the econ department myself, and being hired, you have to publish.
Of course.
And a lot of these kind of journals, they kind of focus very heavily on using a neoclassical framework. So how to kind of change the kind of econ field to increase this pluralism, which you're talking about?
Yeah. No, both great questions. Yeah, football players and healthcare workers. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not a football fan. I'm actually a baseball fan. But I think sports is something that a lot of people enjoy. So I don't mind those people getting paid very well. But I think you could introduce some kind of proportionality. So you may increase taxes on certain kind of pay. I mean, the EU for a while had this the caps on bankers' bonuses after the financial crisis. You could introduce some kind of earmark taxes for certain activities that you recognize as essential but not well rewarded by the market, like healthcare and primary school teaching and so on. Yeah, so I'm not in favor of abolishing the market, but there are so many things that you can do to balance it. I think the problem is that people make this the debates unnecessarily, and actually that probably with bad intentions, extreme. Yeah? So as soon as you criticize some aspects of market, they say, "Oh, do you want to go back to the Soviet days?" Yeah? Or if you criticize something about, say, the welfare state or whatever, and then they say, "Oh, you're a horrible right winger." But once again, when you look at the real world, I mean, there are so many things that we have done, we are still doing, that try to solve these ethical dilemmas. Because as I said earlier, I don't believe that there's one ethical rule that solves every problem. Yeah? I mean, it's my view that every ethical principle, when taken to the extreme, becomes a monster. Yeah? So let's be pragmatic and have a debate. Yeah? I mean, the other nurses are being paid too little. Yeah? A lot of, I don't know about this country, in Britain, a lot of people say yes. Yeah? Well, if people say yes, then how do you make up for it? Yeah? Maybe that you tax the football players, maybe you tax the bankers, yeah? Maybe you create some kind of earmark taxes, yeah? Whatever. Yeah? So that's how I would think about it. Yes, I mean, there's homogeneity of the profession is a huge problem that cannot easily be solved. But one very frightening statistics that I can give you is the concentration of power in the economics profession, not just within, in the neoclassical school, but in a very small group of elite US universities. Yeah? So I have this former student who, actually he did his PhD in the Department of Philosophy of Science, but I was his co-supervisor. And he came up with this shocking statistic showing that, in the economics profession today, if you want to get anywhere, you have to publish in the top 4 journals. It's not even top 5 anymore, because that Review of Economics and Statistics has been left behind. You know, when I was at the young faculty, it was top 10 journals. It's now 4. Yeah? American Economic Review, Econometrica, Review of the Journal of Political Economy, and Quarterly Journal of Economics. Yeah? And my student found that 2/3 of the editors of these 4 journals are from 4 economics departments: Harvard, MIT, Princeton, and Stanford. Yeah? And these economists who preach at the competition, yeah, have been so good at concentrating power in a very small number of elite universities. Yeah? This is a big problem. Yeah? So I think we basically have to change the way that people are assessed. Yeah? I mean, in this one country where non-neoclassical economics has a serious presence, and it is Brazil. Yeah? Basically, half of the top 5 departments are controlled by non-neoclassical economists. Yeah? Keynesians, Latin American structuralists, some Marxists. Yeah? The reason why could they do it is, at least until now, their faculty assessment system says publishing in American Economic Review is as good as publishing in Cambridge Journal of Economics. Eh? If you are not on the neoclassical economists. Eh? So there's an institutional mechanism to guarantee diversity. Eh? You need that. Eh? Because there's no way you can drive failing people out of the university system because of the tenure system, yeah, including myself. Yeah? Because that in government, people can be voted out. Yeah? In business, if you mess up your business, you are kicked out. Yeah? Economists, you know, Robert Lucas, in his 2005 presidential address to the American Economic Review, proudly declared that we have now solved the problem of preventing recessions, yeah? Depression. Yeah? Only to be hit by the biggest depression in 70 years 3 years later. Yeah? You know, this guys Myron Scholes and what's his name? Richard Black, was it that 2 of the 3 guys who won the 1997 Economics Nobel Prize for asset pricing were involved in the failed venture called long-term capital management, which almost brought down the American financial system back in 1998 because they over-invested in Russia. Yeah? But did anyone take these people's Nobel Prize? No. And can you imagine, I mean, the kind of equivalent of this happening in, say, pharmacology? Yeah? If someone declared that we can now cure all cancers, yeah? Only to be proved wrong 3 years later. If someone said, I know how to fix diabetes, yeah, only to be found out that many people died of diabetes because of his treatment. You know, these people would have, if not gone to prison, been disgraced in public. Yeah? But economics is now such an important part of the power structure that these people just pretend that it never happened. Yeah? People don't hear about it. Yeah? So I think that the profession is incapable of kind of becoming diverse, becoming more accountable. So we need the external intervention, yeah? By the public, by the government, whoever. Yeah? Okay, there's one. Huh?
I will try to pick 3.
Okay, let's get the 3 together. Yeah.
What about other economies? So you are talking about food that at least until about 10 years ago was in most parts of the world partly produced outside of GDP. So there was farmers kept their seeds and a lot of economic things were happening that were not part of economics. And so I find very interesting this, like how you write about food. What is the part of other economies in it?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the very entertaining talk. My name is Hannu Vartija, and I'm a professor of economics at this faculty. Right, so, well, I have several points, but I use them to two probably. So first of all, concerning ethics and economics, and the undergraduate student here who asked the interesting question, should it be more prevalent in undergraduate teaching in economics? It probably should, and it's not very much, because in economics we quite often appeal to human guillotine, that there are things that we observe how the world works, and then there are ethical questions how the world should be. It's a separate question. So that's why I think, or that's the underlying argument if you go deep down to it, why economics refrain from making very strong ethical recommendations, and why we only appeal to something which is very weak, like Pareto principle.
Yeah.
So I respectfully little bit disagree that Pareto principle is a monster. It's not a monster in a sense that it's not a sort of a sufficient condition for ethical consideration. It's a necessary one. It's a sort of a weakest possible criteria that you may have, and it's not definitely the only criteria that economists would like to appeal. However, we are not competent to say what is ethical and what is not. That's why we refrain from doing that. But having said this, yes, I completely agree with the student who made the question, or I don't know if that was your purpose, but yes, there should be more discussion in undergraduate teaching in economics, and I guess that this is the right place to advertise a little bit. In the next year, I'm going to give a course on economic justice. However, it's not undergraduate, but rather graduate course. But nevertheless, so that's one point. And then the other point regarding, kind of related to the previous one, regarding business fluctuations, what Bob Lucas said about solving business depressions, business economic fluctuations. Obviously, that is a silly statement, and probably it was a joke. Well, at least with the benefit of hindsight. But then on the other hand, we don't have experience or evidence of the counterfactual. What would have happened if economists would have not developed the theories and the models and policy measures that try to mitigate economic fluctuation. For example, if you think about the 2008 financial crisis, there was a clear danger of that escalating to the level of let's say, Great Depression. But it didn't.
Sure,
probably, or most likely, partly because of the policy measures that were taken. Concluding from the evidence that because there are still economic fluctuations, that economists haven't done anything about that, I think that it's a little bit sort of a, how would I put it, straightforward conclusion. But yeah, but that comes to the point regarding human guillotine, that economists try to understand how the economy works, and that's basically it. And then there are politicians who make the decisions on the basis of these findings. That's, I think, is kind of a natural starting point.
Okay, yeah. I try to keep this question short. Was your presentation and probably is your presentation and your book critical of current conditions in society or the academic subject economics?
Sorry, I don't quite understand. Yeah.
So during your presentation, you talked about day's topics or facts, what happened in the world, and you're, if I understood correctly, you seem disappointed at some problems that exist today in society, but there was some middle ground critique of economics as an academic subject. Are you more concerned about the world as it is, or more concerned about the
Okay, yeah.
subject?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, yeah, so, no, thank you for those great questions. One more, yeah.
Okay, Uskalimäki, nice meeting you. We have more to talk later today. Anyway, this is about you writing these books. First of all, my praise for this one. It's absolutely fantastic. I seldom read popular economics books, but this is an exception. It's an intellectual adventure at its best. So you make these claims that we have heard today. Everyone should learn some economics. This would be good for democracy, etc. Very agreeable, of course. You also say that descriptive economics is characterized by the dominance of one school. Not much diversity, at least not enough diversity there. And it follows from these two statements that taking your advice for people to learn some economics is likely to lead them to learn what the dominant school is saying about things, what it has to offer in exclusion to other viewpoints. But this would not satisfy you, because you would like them to learn more from a more diverse source of understanding. So there's a tension here, and the question is how to resolve that tension. And it seems that your line is to keep writing these popular books and thereby to fill the shelves of libraries. When people go to learn some economics, they are more likely to hit your book rather than the one from the dominant school or something like that. Is this your mission?
No, thank you for that. Yeah. Okay, on the issue of food, well, I mean, there isn't really much about economics of food in this book. So, I mean, that's one subject I haven't really written about. I mean, as I said, food is only the lure or the bait or bribe, depending on how you see it. I haven't done much work on the food systems, which is not to say that I don't recognize its importance. I mean, it's one of the most critical things that in our lives, and I totally accept its importance. But unfortunately, I don't have a huge amount of knowledge on that aspect of the world. Okay, ethics. Yeah, I think you don't probably need to teach a whole course of ethics, which probably the economics professors, including myself, are not really fit to teach anyway. But I think it is important to tell the students that economics has ethical foundations, and the dominant ethical framework, the Paretian framework, is not necessarily something that everyone subscribes to. Now, it is true that the Paretian framework is weaker than other ethical framework, but that still doesn't mean that it's not based on some kind of ethical principles. And more importantly, given the influence that economics has on the rest of the world, I think economics economists have greater responsibility to be aware of their ethical foundations, because probably it doesn't matter that much that what the ethical foundations of some theories of sociologists or political scientists have, but the economists have so much more influence that I think they need to be more aware of their responsibilities. I'm not saying that the economists having so much power is necessarily a good thing, but that's the reality, and therefore I think that awareness of this is necessary. Now, Lucas, I don't know. I mean, the reason why we could deal with the 2008 crisis in so far as we have dealt with it, I mean, initially it was thanks to Keynesian theories, not the Chicago theories. But also, later we, have dealt with it with all these weird kind of theories that have no basis in the kind of theories that Lucas had in mind. I mean, all this the zero interest rate and quantitative easing. I just don't understand how people can advocate a system where there's essentially no, or at least very, very weakened price mechanism in the capital market, because zero interest rate basically means there's no way to tell a good project from a bad one. So, I think that, I agree with you that the economists that have not been totally useless. They have made contributions, but insofar as we have dealt with this the crisis, it was more because of non-neoclassical macro theories than the neoclassical macro theories that Lucas had in mind when he made that speech. Now, is it the economics that is wrong, or the world that is wrong? I think it's a bit of both. But the book is more about the world. It does talk about different economic theories. But if you are interested in my view of different economic theories, probably you should read the previous book, Economics, the User's Guide. But because this book is more about, what is going to be the impact of automation? How do we deal with climate change? Should developing countries industrialize? And what is the real role of the welfare state and so on, rather than whether this theory or that theory is better. Yeah? I'm in this book mainly interested in the real world. Yeah? Finally, how do you do this? Yeah, very often the problem of the people advocating the whatever the alternative view, the alternative to the dominant view that they are advocating, the problem with them is that they think their view wants to become the dominant view. Yeah? But I don't believe so, because I don't have one particular school of economics to promote. Yeah? I happen to use what I call the productionist tradition and institutionalist and so on, because they are more suited to the kind of problems that I analyze. But if I'm doing macroeconomics, that I should be doing Keynes, and if I'm working on innovation, I should read Schumpeter, and more importantly, current neo-Schumpeterians like Nelson and Lundvall and these people. So, basically the famous British expression, horses for courses. Depending on the problem, there's not necessarily the best, but there's one better theory or a couple of better theories. So that's how I see it. So I am advocating pluralism, but not a particular view of the world. Yeah? It's that fundamental dilemma about that, if you like, the democracy. Do you even include people who want to abolish democracy? Yeah? So it's a bit like that. Where do you draw the line between the pluralism and having a particular view of the world? I mean, so I would like to emphasize the need for pluralism rather than a particular way of thinking. But more importantly, I mean, I don't think it's possible to, change the world by writing books. I mean, if that was possible, the world would have already been idealized. I mean, but actually, there is at least in Britain and some parts of the United States. I mean, there's this kind of grassroots movement, often led by these young economists who had their baptism of fire during the 2008 financial crisis, when they walked into their classroom and the professors were not even discussing the financial crisis. I mean, the rethinking economics generation, and they have been very, very good at kind of organizing this economics education programs for ordinary citizens, and going and working in the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, and so on, to change what is being done there. So I think we need this kind of grassroots activities. And yeah, I see myself as someone who kind of stimulates these things rather than providing answers, which no single person can do. And I think that as I keep saying, I mean, I don't think that my view is necessarily correct. I mean, there's one thing that is correct in my view, which is the need for pluralism. But beyond that, I mean, that what economic theory you apply to what situation will depend on, who you are, what you believe in, what your society is like, what time of the human history you are living in. So, basically, the most important thing is to have as many people as possible to be interested in these issues and talk about these issues, rather than telling them, oh, here's the best solution. Why are you not reading this? Let's leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we finish, I would like to thank a series of people. First, I would like to thank our team, particularly Jessica and Demo, for helping or making this possible altogether. I would like to, of course, thank the Finnish Cultural Foundation for funding these activities. And I would like to thank all of you for coming here today, and to our online audience also for their presence. And finally, of course, I would like to thank Ha-Joon for writing this wonderful book and accepting to come here and give this excellent talk. Thanks very much.
Thank you.